All right, so this is part two for Monday, April 20th. If you haven't watched part one, then please go back and do that. But onto some new stuff here with Unit 7, Lesson 4. Again, the topic, our unit's called the 4th of July, not to talk about the 4th of July like Independence Day, but goes back to the Frederick Douglass speech, what to the American slave is the 4th of July. So just pointing out the idea that in this country we're celebrating independence and freedom and liberty, but we are not granting it to millions of people to various degrees, right? Not just with Black Africans, with African Americans, with Native Americans, women not be extended their full rights. So anyway, um, one thing that I remember being a kid and you learn about slavery and we talked about how it affected the family with some of Frederick Douglass's primary sources, and we talked about some of the reasons for it, right? Economic reasons, but also just sort of straight out racist reasons, where people looking at the color of people's skins. I can't stress enough that I could teach well, I don't know if I could teach an entire class about slavery, but it is a big topic, and I don't mean to rush through it here, but there's other things that we have to get to, and we'll talk more about it during the Civil War. But slavery is something that affected tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people just in North America. People who were living in West Africa who were kidnapped from their homes and brought to North America, which later became the United States. I mean, it is a big topic, and it lasted for centuries. And one of the questions that I always had, as even in grade school or middle school, was, well, did slaves fight back? Well, the short answer is yes, sometimes. Um, Probably the most famous slavery rebellion was led by a guy named Nat Turner. I actually did a research paper on Nat Turner when I was in college. So, I had to research probably a 10 to 12 page paper about him. I also remember watching a TV movie about Denmark Vesey when I was younger. Um, it starred a guy who had been in one of my favorite James Bond movies, so I started watching it. And even as a young kid, it was pretty interesting to me. But anyway, the Nat Turner Slave Rebellion is here, so that's part of your assignment, is to read about it. And the only question you actually have to answer today is, if you think that the artist who drew this drawing of Nat Turner's Slave Rebellion, which took place in 1831 in Southampton, I think, Virginia, if you think that the artist is anti-slavery or pro-slavery. So that's actually the only question you have to answer today, by sort of analyzing this image right here. So keep in mind, it's made in 1831, so it's not exactly going to be Pixar quality. But a couple other images I wanted to get to, which is, going into our next group called abolitionists. So to abolish something means to get rid of it. So we're going to talk about some of the more prominent abolitionists in America. Some were black, some were white, some were religious, some were non-religious. Most were relatively peaceful, because if you're fighting against um, a terribly violent institution like slavery, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense that if your problem with slavery is how violent and awful it is, to also be violent and awful in return. However, John Brown, who is here, definitely disagreed with that. Um, he was basically somebody who thought that the way for slavery to end was to basically kill slave owners. And if there were no more slave owners, then we wouldn't have to worry about slavery. He's a fascinating person in American history, and one that we'll read a little bit more about tomorrow. But the image I want to look at is something called tragic prelude. So you think about what prelude means, right? It's something that comes before. John Brown actually died in 1859, before the Civil War had even begun. But his actions, some would argue, helped cause the Civil War. So I love this painting, and we've looked at a lot of paintings in here, especially during the American Revolution, about how many different things are going on. Um, We'll also look at some pictures of what John Brown actually looked like. But this painting, as I said, called Tragic Prelude, it appears at the, as it says down here, the Kansas State Capitol building in Topeka, because this is all about the time that John Brown spent in what's called a period of American history in the 1850s called Bleeding Kansas. John Brown, born in Connecticut, he lived a lot of his adult life in Ohio. He actually worked on the Underground Railroad. But for John Brown, if he wants to be someone who's actually fighting slavery, he had to go to where the fight for slavery was. Missouri was a slave state. Kansas was a free territory. But many wanted to make Kansas a slave territory to go along with its neighbor, Missouri. So John Brown decided, well, that's where the slave owners are, so that's where I should go. But then to look at some of the images here. So obviously, you've got the American flag on one side, you've got the Confederate flag on the other. So, as far as historically accurate, well, first of all, John Brown wasn't 9.5 feet tall. And as I said, he wasn't even alive by the time the Civil War came. But he helped usher in this period of violence. A couple things to notice, right? We've got some sunflowers over here, so maybe when you think about Kansas, you might think about sunflowers. You've got the tornado sort of adding to the chaos in the background. You've got the wildfire that's happening back here as well. Notice what direction, if I can make an arrow, notice what direction these settlers are moving in. Right now, if you said left, yes, that's true. But if we were looking at a map of the United States, we would say that they are moving to their left. A couple other things with John Brown, right? So he's got a gun in one hand to signify that just sort of the duality of it, that he's got a gun in one hand, but then he also has a Bible in the other. He was a very religious man, but he felt that the Bible gave him um, the responsibility almost to fight against slavery with violence. And there are actually Greek letters on here, alpha and omega. And anytime you hear the alpha and omega, it's the first letter of the Greek alphabet and the last letter of the Greek alphabet. So talking about sort of like everything is here, from the beginning to the end, to give the importance of the Bible. What else I want to say? Also, take a look at sort of his posture, right? So we've got a long vertical line here and then a shorter vertical line there. What sort of maybe image or symbolism do you think the artist is trying to, this John Stuart Curry, as he wrote this? Maybe I'm looking a little bit too far into it, but I don't think that the pose of John Brown is done on accident. So that might be something for you to take a shot at. Um, Going down, so while this happened in Bleeding Kansas, I believe it was 1855, although it lasted for a few months. Um, but another relatively famous um, uh, painting also comes about. So, as all this is happening in Kansas, the presidents at the time, yes, including Franklin Pierce, very ineffective, James Buchanan, relatively ineffective president as well. Congress, the senators, the House of Representatives, is in chaos. And Charles Sumner, who is this man right here, was a senator from Massachusetts. And after a particularly vicious attack in Kansas, Charles Sumner got up in the Senate chambers and delivered a speech that was very harsh against slave owners and the many of the Southerners reacted, well, let's just say strongly to it. So the person with a cane here is a guy named Preston Smith Brooks, who was a representative from South Carolina. So having been insulted, he felt, based upon Charles Sumner's speech, Preston Smith Brooks breaks out in violence. Charles Sumner was severely, severely wounded in this attack. In fact, he had to take years off from taking his place in the Senate. Preston Smith Brooks ended up resigning from the House of Representatives in South Carolina, but ended up being reelected later on. So that sort of shows you that even though Preston Smith Brooks nearly beat a man to death in the Capitol building, that his actions were obviously seen as being, supported by his constituency back in South Carolina. So you have someone who is pro-slavery in Preston Smith Brooks with somebody who is anti-slavery, and the states they're from, right, South Carolina and Massachusetts. In fact, there is, I believe, on the southeast side of the Boston Common. Not that anybody is going outside anytime soon, but there is a statue of Charles Sumner that is there. And then you can see in the background that as people try to interfere with the violent attack, they are being kept back with people with swords and canes. And I believe there was a gun that was there as well. At the bottom, where it says Southern chivalry arguments versus clubs. First of all, I'm not really sure why that apostrophes there, but this is sort of poking fun at the idea that sometimes one of the um, stereotypes, let's say, of people in the South is that they have good manners. Well, I don't know if stereotype's the right word, but anyway, that's sort of something that they're acknowledged as having. So this is poking fun at that the nice manners of the South, whereas someone in Massachusetts, might not necessarily be described as someone having nice manners, but this guy is giving a speech. He's using his words to make an argument, whereas the proper Southern gentleman is obviously not doing that. So this is actually, I mean, again, this happened in the Capitol building. So when people talk about like, oh, in 2020 or 2019, the America's never been more divided, and all the Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi and all of that, I think people should take a step back and realize that it was much worse in the 1850s and 1860s with regard to this. I mean, we had a senator nearly beaten to death by a representative in the Capitol building. So some crazy stuff. So again, the only take a look at some images there. The only image, question rather, that you have to report back on is taking a closer look at this drawing. And do you think that the author, or the artist rather, is anti-slavery or pro-slavery? So that's the only thing you have to do today. And hopefully you turned in the assignment that was due this morning. All right, everybody, have a great day, and I will check in with you later. Oh, one last thing I forgot. I provided comments to every single person who turned in a current event from last Monday. So if you want to see my reaction to what you did, then go ahead and check that out. As before, I thought they were very well done, and I'm so pleased that this is an assignment that so many of you, the current events that you guys are doing well with, because it's interesting to hear your take on some of these global and national issues. All right, bye for now.